Welcome in everyone to HogvilleNET YouTube Live. I guess it's good morning, 10:30 Friday, August 2nd. We've gotten through July, a busy month. When you look at recruiting, when you look at the Arkansas Razorbacks under John Calipari, year one, he's about 110, 115 days into the job. And it was an interesting weekend last weekend, really busy. Don't expect it to be as busy this weekend. Or it was actually a bookend to the weekend. Friday, a week ago today, you had the big commitment from 2025 five-star Darius Acuff Jr., the 6'3" point guard from Detroit. Then on Saturday, we got a message from the University of Arkansas men's basketball department that Calipari was going to hold a press conference to kind of recap the summer on Monday morning. And so that was at 11 a.m. Monday morning at Bud Walton Arena in Fayetteville. I made the trek up from Little Rock. So Friday and Monday, you had a lot of activity going on in terms of recruiting. And then Calipari having his first podium moment since his introductory press conference back in April, when he was, the first day on the job, I guess, technically. Since that time, we've had him in a few media scrums outside of certain events, certainly nothing formal like we had in the press conference Monday. And it wasn't just Calipari. We had a trio of Razorbacks, Trevor Brazil, Adu Thiero, and Boogie Flan. So we're going to talk about what we're going to do is I mentioned Acuff. We're going to actually get into some recruiting stuff kind of toward the end. We're going to get into some stuff that matters with both the 2025 class and the 2026 class. As we now kind of look back at the spring and summer, we're not going to get into all the nitty gritty details, but where things are starting to land in terms of interest, what visits might be coming up, because now players are getting ready to go back to school. And then, the door will be open in the fall for players to come in for visits. Remember, July was a dead period other than coaches going out on the road for some evaluation events that were allowed by the NCAA. But first, let's get to the press conference. We're going to get to specifics in recruiting later. A lot of takeaways from this. I was, like I said, it was last minute kind of a thing in terms of when the media found out that this was going down. But it certainly felt like, more than just a cursory, update on some things. Was I surprised that AJ Dybantsa cut us from his list? Okay, so we're going to get to recruiting later. I'm already seeing comments come up. Thank you for the comments. We're going to get to that. But I thought the press conference, Calipari led off with a, sort of an opening statement. Then he opened it up to questions with the media, and he spoke for 30, 35 minutes. And some of the things that really stood out to me were his excitement level, his energy, the confidence he exudes. Of course, he knows how to speak to the media. He's one of the best at doing it. But he really he hit on three important things. He said, when you looked at what he's done so far on the court with those limited practices, 4 hours per week, you have 8 weeks to do that. You spend June and July, nothing new there, nothing new relative to this staff and previous staffs when comparing that part of it. But he says really laying the foundation and establishing a culture, all the time on the court basically dedicated to individual development. And as part of that there were competitive drills. So it was individual development that was focused on, and then getting into some competition within that, and learning how to be competitive. And so no running of plays, no out of bounds plays, no sets, nothing like that was introduced. This is a little bit different. Each coach has their own way of doing things. And so some of the talking points that came out of these three things, establishing a culture and a foundation, individual development, including some competitive work, some of the things that came out of that, Calipari says he wants to get his players to be comfortable being uncomfortable. So they put them in situations or maybe not in their comfort zone, and they've got to deal with the adversity and play through it and figure out how to be successful dealing with some of those things. And so when you start talking about player development, a guy that gets players ready for the next level, this is part of that process. And again, this is a little bit different than even the previous staff, and I would say the one before that. When you start talking Mike Anderson and then Eric Patrick Musman, and then some of these larger, grander, bigger picture things that Calipari talked about. By the way, a lot of this stuff I'm repeating. It's been a few days, Monday, and here we are Friday. You've probably already seen highlights or the full press conferences by Calipari and the three players. And so a lot of these takeaways I'm just sharing, but I'm also putting my own thoughts on some of this stuff in terms of what I take from it. But he talked about players thinking bigger, expecting more, and he used an analogy, and he told a story about he wants his players to think like kings, think bigger, uh, not to think that their goals are dreams that are unattainable, but they're goals that they can actually make happen. And part of that's learning how to think bigger, think differently to think bigger. So I thought that was interesting. Again, when you look at how many first round draft picks the guys put through, how many players went in the lottery, how many players are getting max contracts and all-star kind of, a lot of this starts with him, and it's been like that for decades. Some of the stuff, the talking points that he touched on, and and of course, talking about his top 8 or 9, he's also reminding fans to be patient. I think you mentioned that a couple of times. But specifically, the players that stood out that he talked about, to me, what stood out as the talking points, um, is he talked about how both Trevor and Brazil and Boogie Flan were better than he thought. He mentioned Adu Thiero without being asked, saying that he's been really, really good and been working on the things that they've asked him to work on. And so those were kind of the 3 positives I saw in terms of jumping out and speaking in the positive about players. He obviously talking about Nelly Davis and Jonas Adu. These are guys that have been deep into NCAA tournaments with their previous teams, Florida Atlantic and Tennessee, respectively. All league guys. In the case of Nelly Davis, co-player of the year last year in his conference. And he talked about some areas, putting Davis in situations where he's uncomfortable and he's got to rise up. Talking about Jonas Adu getting better, moving his feet, and some of the things they're working on. So he didn't brag as much about those guys, other than to say, when I asked him specifically about them, about leadership and some of the other qualities they bring, that they're holding their own. And so I think he spent a little bit more time on players that we wouldn't necessarily think going into the season are going to be flashing those big preseason accolades. And some of these guys, though, when we talk about Brazil and Thiero, have had their own share of recognition. They haven't quite gotten to a point yet where they've delivered on all the potential and promise. I just wrote about that. I have an article at HogvilleNET, also at KNWA, I put out yesterday evening. You can go check that out, where I really talked about Brazil and Thiero as kind of wild cards. And the reason I see them as wild cards, and I've mentioned, Calipari saying that Brazil's better than he thought he was, and then Thiero's been really good so far. But the reason they're wild cards to me, a couple of reasons. Remember now, these were guys, first of all, that were not locks. If you look at the top 9 players, these are the 2, in my opinion, that were never locks or necessarily likely to follow Calipari or play for Calipari at Arkansas. Thiero jumped into the portal before Calipari was known to be leaving Kentucky. And there was a point in time where Calipari had accepted, I've talked about this before, and accepted the commitment from Jordan Burks, a player from coming over from Kentucky, who plays a similar position, was a freshman last year, hadn't done as much work and not projected as highly as Thiero. But that changed, and Burks ends up going to Georgetown because Thiero came back in the picture. Brazil, everybody thought he was out the door. No one really saw Brazil coming back until kind of the last minute, when he'd been in both the portal, the NBA draft pool. He withdrew, I think, a day before the deadline to get out of the draft pool to come back to college. And then he withdrew from the portal. Within a week, he was committed to Calipari in Arkansas. Those 2 players represented the 7th and 9th commitments to Calipari in this Arkansas team. So wild cards, number 1, it was never a lock. I think the other thing is, positionally, their versatility is going to really, really matter on Arkansas's front line. When you look at the top 9, at least 5 of those are backcourt players. Thiero is a 3-4 combo, so he can play the wing, but he can also help you on that front line. But if you count him as a front line piece, you only have 4 that, and then help you as a rim protector. He can be a volume rebounder and help you in situations where either you need it at the 5 spot, or based on matchups and strategy and personnel groupings that you want to, that may be clicking. And so both of those guys add the kind of versatility you need on a front line that only goes 4 deep. Big Z still a bit of an unknown commodity, only 15 games last year. We mentioned Jonas Adu. He'll be the anchor at the 5 spot. But I think these guys are wild cards for multiple reasons. The other thing is, Thiero's got projections as a first-round draft pick in the 2025 draft, just next year. But through 2 seasons at Kentucky, he's had some good games, but he's not done the kind of work where you look at that and go, okay, I see that 100%. You're still waiting to see more. He's grown. I think he arrived at Kentucky 2 years ago at 6'4". He's around 6'8" now, maybe still growing. Brazil was first team preseason All SEC last year. He was a guy that injury the year before after transferring from Missouri early in the season had put up some really good games and looked like an all league kind of guy. EPM, Eric Patrick Melsman, referred to Brazil as a top 5 player in the SEC when he went down with that injury and didn't get to play in the league. This past year, looked like to me he was still favoring the knee, had an ankle issue. He was never quite right. He did have a few double doubles, and including a big one and a big win at home over Duke in the ACC SEC Challenge. But another guy that was projected after, coming back from that knee, and then in October on Arkansas's pro day with NBA folks in there, he went nuts, and the pro folks were telling me, look, this guy could be a lottery pick if he can consistently show some of this stuff and be productive and efficient through the season and playing in the SEC. Here's a guy that's likely a lottery pick. So he went through the draft process, had some good things that happened for him at the combine. But both he and Thiero end up at Arkansas, Brazil and Thiero. And so they both have shown promise. There's potential there. There's been talk of first round draft pick, lottery draft pick, but in terms of resume, neither player has quite laid it down yet. Where you look at that resume in college in the SEC and go, this is almost a no brainer. You're still not quite there yet. So I talk about those guys in terms of being wild cards. I like hearing that Calipari says Boogie Flynn is better than he thought he was. I'm not sure how good he thought he was, but he was a top 15 rated McDonald's All-American who, in my opinion, was likely the MVP of the McDonald's All-American game, and hit the game winner in that, in a competitive game where it wasn't necessarily your typical All-Star game. Guys were really getting after it and playing to win. And so some of these positive talking points about players and going through it, but so he didn't spend a lot of time, Calipari did, on Nelly Davis and Jonas Adu. I think that's probably by design. I don't know what he needs to say about those guys. We can ask, how are they acclimating? They're both transfers into a program, first time under Calipari, but they've been so exceptional, not only as individual players, but how they help teams get to an Elite Eight or a Final Four, that I think, what else does Calipari need to say about those guys right now? And again, they haven't gotten into true team structures. Most of it's drill and individual work. There has been competition. Thank you, Kevin. You're great. Well, okay, let's get to, I'm sorry. I need to put these on. I always say I'm going to do better with the comments, and I don't necessarily do that. Okay. So, he talked about Big Z. He goes, look, Big Z, we don't want him shooting threes. We want him, if he's going to face up and play that way, maybe the elbow jumper. And Big Z's the kind of guy that he does a good job finishing around the basket. He can finish lobs, or if he gets a rebound and a putback, he keeps the ball high. He's got a nice touch around the basket. I like the way he uses the glass or finishes around the rim when he doesn't go glass. And of course, Trevor Brazile was another player that Calipari says, we don't necessarily want him shooting threes. Brazile even said, my mid-range is probably a better place for me to shoot. And we saw Brazile a lot last year in many games, at least half, if not the bulk of his field goal attempts were from behind the three-point arc. A lot of times he was camped out there. And there's criticism on that, on the way things went down last year. Nothing seemed to really work. But a lot of what Brazile, if you watched his lack of physicality on both ends of the court around the basket, sometimes getting him away from the basket worked a little bit better. But you got to challenge players, work on their individual progress, work on their development, and get them to get out of their comfort zones, which are exactly the talking points that Calipari made. And so you're starting to get a sense, you're starting to get a feel maybe of some expectations of what guys are going to be allowed to do, or maybe curtail some things, get your bigs playing closer and being more effective around the basket. Calipari also talked about, look, he wants his team to be able to run fast, play slow in terms of how their mind, so that they don't play in a hurry. So the game slows down in their mind, but he wants them to be able to play fast and with urgency. And he's got track coaches in there helping them learn how to run. But I think the big thing is, when I go back and look at Calipari's best teams, we always talk about athleticism, size, talent, skill, all these things, length. But what they've really been good at, his best teams, in my opinion, are using all that and getting out in transition. Sometimes when everything else is equal, his teams have been really good on the offensive glass, his better teams, and have been really good in transition. And sometimes just being able to get out and run and get easy baskets is the difference between wins and losses. And I'm sense based on these talking points with Calipari that this is his process. This is how he does it. Getting track coaches involved with how to run, getting guys learning how to play fast and get in transition. He talked about the run game. At the pace they want to play, they've got to do these things. And so this is a first time, over 40 or 4 decades at UMass, Memphis, and Kentucky, when you're on the outside looking in, you get used to over that much time how a coach does things from an outsider's perspective in terms of, because I notice his team's typically really good offensive rebounding, good in transition, but we don't really know the process and how it bakes in, how all that is baked in, or gets baked in early in the processes. We're going to see that now because Calipari's the coach at Arkansas, so we're getting these opportunities to really drill down on how he gets from A to Z in a season. And so I'm a little fascinated by it. I'm sure you are too. Um, One of the things that stood out to me that he talked about that he thinks he's got 3 to 4 point guards. Well, I can identify 3 lead guard likelies. It's obvious to me: Boogie Flynn, DJ Wagner, who, by the way, didn't say a lot about other than we know that DJ can be as good as anybody. And he talked about the high ankle sprain still. So that makes me wonder, is that problematic? Is it something he's not quite fully back to where he was pre-injury? Those things can linger and can keep a player from being their full self and play to their full ability. So if that's a little bit alarming or concerning, I can understand that because I wasn't preparing or expecting to hear any ankle talk for DJ Wagner. I don't know what I expected, but that wasn't one of the things. And so he didn't say much about him. But obviously, DJ Wagner, in my opinion, will be your starting lead guard along with Nelly Davis at the 2. And then Thiero, Brazil, and Jonas Adu. To me, I've been saying for a while, I think that'll be the initial starting 5. We'll see what happens, but I believe that's it. It goes back to more of that wild card talk. Those 2 players, Brazil and Thiero, being in your starting 5, with all the versatility they bring lineup wise, they may be on the court together to start games. But going back to 3 to 4 point guards, DJ Wagner, Boogie Flynn, we've always said those guys were going to be probably your primary ball handlers in concert with each other. There might be times we're on the court together. Certainly Nelly Davis can play the 2 and the 1. So there's 3, but he said 3 to 4. And to me, the next 2 prime candidates would be a Carter Knox because of his ability. You can run offense through him because of his ability to get downhill and slash and read situations. He's a fantastic, what I would call an alpha mentality scorer. But another possibility is Adu Thiero. Remember, he started at 6'4". He's got guard skills. He came into college as a guard. He's so big and athletic at 6'8", 220 that he's going to have to play on that front line some. But he'll be on the wing, and I'm not sure that you can't run some stuff through him and that he can't handle a little bit. But I'm intrigued by the 3 to 4 because we know who the first 3 are. I mentioned it: Wagner, Boogie Flynn, DJ Wagner, Boogie Flynn, and Nelly Davis. But perhaps you're talking Carter Knox and or Adu Thiero if you're talking 3 or 4 guys that can be primary ball handlers and lead your offense a little bit. So those things really stood out to me when he talked about Carter Knox. Remember, Carter Knox, 6'6", big time scorer and producer at Overtime Elite last year. Really talented player, McDonald's All-American. Another player that Calipari said, I want to see him stop settling for jump shots. I really want to see him get into his drive game, get to the rim. And look, I understand that because it's not that you don't want your players developing their perimeter game, but you want to play to their strengths first and foremost. You want to start there. And, he talked about Billy Richmond, the other 5-star freshman. They've listed him now at 6'5", explosive player, one of the best slashers out of the high school ranks from that 2024 class. Really, he could stack him up against any of these classes as an athletic rim hunter. But Calipari kind of said the reverse of him. He needs to get more consistent shooting the ball from the perimeter because defenders are going to, when they scout him, if he can't knock down a shot a little bit consistently, they're going to back off of him, and it's going to take away even the slash game. And so now you've got a blind spot offensively. You're playing 4-on-5 to some degree, and so you've got to find ways to get players to maximize the areas where they need to be better at. So I understand Billy Richmond and the idea of him getting, he's a lefty. If he's not getting all of the way to the rim, what I've noticed when I've watched him and really broken down the game film is he likes to drive to certain spots in the mid-range, pull up with that little lefty shot. And I think they just want him to be more consistent. You'd like to see a guy like that be able to be competent on your wing if he's left open from three and knock some of that down, because then it puts the defenders in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, and so they're going to push up a little more on him to defend that, and then it really plays in his ability to drive and slash. And now he's got a numbers advantage and one of the best finishers coming from the high school ranks. Carter Knox is another guy. When you watch him, you know, one of the things I said previously was he really needed to work on his ball handling. He's got a great setup in his drives to get to finishes, but his initial dribble off the first step and some of his stuff is not always clean. And then he has to compensate for that to get into his full drive, which makes you wonder how much improvement has he made in those situations where he might even be someone that you could run your offense through a little bit. I just wonder about some of those things. You know, going back to Adu Fierro, Calipari said he has been working on stuff he needed to work on. I didn't mention what some of that was. He needs to improve his three-point shooting percentage. I think on low volume at Kentucky last year, he was around 31, 32%. You'd like to see him improve on that efficiency, and then you would likely see his volume allowed to increase if he's knocking them down at a higher clip. You know, he needs to work on his ball handling as well. A guy that does have some guard instincts, but you want to see him improve there. And of course, he's a guy that can be physical. He spoke to that. But some of these position groups intrigue me. And Calipari, when I asked him about it, talked about all these guys, the top 9 guys, and what he really didn't do was get into the other guys. He said there's 10, then there's 10, 11, and 12. Well, there's Melo Sanchez, the Division II transfer, 6'4" shooter, Jaden Karaletwa, the 6'6" wing out of California coming out of high school. You've got a couple of players, a couple more guards. Aiden Kelly, 6 foot, 6'1", out of Mississippi. And then you have Kareem Watkins, the 5'8" guard that was a walk-on for 4 years at Kentucky. He didn't mention those guys by name. Those are the 4 players that we know about that came in after the top 9. And there's been some dispute. Are these guys really going to be outside and not really help much? And I think the more that we see the practice clips that come out now quite a bit from the University of Arkansas social media, you just don't see any of these players featured or doing anything really. You might see them in the background somewhere, and they weren't talked about in the press conference. So the further along we move, I think it becomes more and more clear whether some of or all of them are on some kind of actual athletic scholarship. They are more like just sort of scout team walk-on type pieces to the puzzle. Bodies to get you through practice, not necessarily expected or very likely not expected to crack a rotation. It's not to say that something doesn't happen or someone out of that group emerges and helps you a little bit somewhere. But right now, it's not even foreseeable. It's not even foreseeable based on that. And so I don't say all that to be negative or disparaging. We're talking about the roster. We're talking about what we gleaned and learned from this presser. I called it a State of the Hoop Hogs address. You know, summer recap, but there was a lot going on with a new program. And so there's really a lot to talk about. So mention all that. The one player, and this got a little bit tricky a few weeks ago when the class of 2024 top 150 3-star guard, Casimir Chavis, 6'3" guard out of Minneapolis, had originally signed with Washington, had several high major programs recruiting him, backed out of that in April after a coaching change with the Huskies, and ended up committing a few weeks ago to Arkansas. Well, he makes his commitment announcement, which is on him, right? It's in the spring period, so he can sign a letter of intent. Or if it's after the letter of intent period, he can still sign a financial aid agreement. But what we saw after that, a day or two after his public commitment, was the University of Arkansas formally announcing these other 4 players who I just mentioned: Sanchez, Karaletwa, Kelly, and Kareem Watkins. And so you had those 4 players formally announced. Well, Chavis's name never came up in the press conference. Calipari cannot comment specifically on players that are recruits, even commits, until they've formally been have signed letters of intent or financial agreements, and those have been certified by the NCAA. And we've seen nothing formal or official from the University of Arkansas on Chavis up to the point of going to this presser. And so I think the media in there understood not to bring his name up because Calipari can't speak to it directly, nor can any of the Razorback players that were in there. But I did ask Arkansas's basketball sports information director, Mike Haywood, after the press conference, do we have an update on when this is going to be official and publicly announced? And I got a series of shoulder shrugs. You know, that's what I got. And so, you know, it's been a minute since he committed, but the commitment is on him. It's not official until, again, his paperwork certified. So then you're wondering, well, you know, was he in summer school? You know, once I got the shoulder shrug, to me, that tells me if it's not official yet, does it become official soon? Is that one of those things that's pending? You know, what's going on there? But until it is, and until he's accepted and goes through the proper channels, you know, he's not participating in limited summer work. Now that's over. They got a break until school, you know, they'll get back and school starts back soon. And then they'll have more limited practice for a while until it ramps up. So we'll see what plays out there. But I know people were asking about that. His name didn't come up, and it's never been formally, officially released by the university as a done deal. And until that happens, even Calipari can't comment. Okay, so we've gone through the roster. We talked about, you know, some of the stuff that matters. We're going to talk specifics in recruiting, class 2012, 25, and 2026 a little bit later. I want to get through some other stuff that we talked about. Recruiting, generally speaking, Calipari was asked about it. And we know that his philosophy has changed in terms of how many high school guys he's going to take every class. He spoke to that. Again, 3 or 4 guys instead of 6 or 7. We know that true transfers out of the portal. I don't necessarily consider the 3 players that followed him over from Kentucky as true transfers. They're sticking with Cal. It was just that he changed the job. And then you had one returning player in Trevor Brazil, who's basically like a transfer to Calipari. It gets a little interesting, doesn't it? But going forward, he continues to talk about wanting to have some player retention. So keep some of these top 9 guys. Maybe some of the back end guys, a Sanchez or a Carolette at some point, sticks around and helps you. Who knows? You know, I think that he'll continue to recruit guys rated higher than those guys, and that may never happen for him, but you just never know. But when he's talking about the recruiting philosophy, yeah, the philosophy's changed, but the formula on how he recruits has not changed a bit. He talked about it. It's exactly the same. And if you look at the results, let's say it again, he's the GOAT of recruiting all time. Very impressed. He told a story about Emmanuel Quickly, who he recruited to Kentucky a few classes ago, I think five years ago. He was in that freshman class, I believe, with Tyrese Maxey. It was a really good team. In fact, that team in 1920 won the SEC, but that was the COVID year, and that team never got to play in postseason. Nobody did. Got to play. There was no NCAA tournament. So, you know, but from that recruit, you know, there was, he talked about that recruitment and some of the things he talks about. And he got it back into the talking points. If you're drinking, clubbing, chasing, you don't need to be here. If there's a little bit of fraud in you, you don't need to come here. So he talks about his talking points. He doesn't beg recruits. You know, he wants players to want to be with him and in his program as much as he wants them. So there's no begging. He talked, and we're going to get into staff a little bit, but he talked about his son, Brad Calipari, who's now for a first-time assistant coach for his dad for Calipari, and how he was already on the road. We reported this in the spring and summer during live eval periods, but that he would be one of the assistants that could help take off some of the load of going on the road and doing recruiting. Arkansas still needs a rebounder. Adu. Some comments flashing over. I'm just kind of blurting them out. But he talked about Calipari. Now, here's the other interesting little nugget I'm going to give you. He mentioned that we want to bring in Tyler Eulis. Well, we've been reporting that for a while. Once it was understood that Ronnie Bird Jr. had a different title, Director of Student Athlete Development, and then there was still a 5th assistant coaching slot open. Everything else is pretty much resolved. Tyler Eulis, the former Kentucky player, has been a student assistant coach at Kentucky the last 2 years. We've been saying he's earmarked now. That's the guy. We knew it was going to be between him and Brewer. Now it appears it's Eulis. And Calipari mentioned it. And he, in concert with Brad Calipari, as those 2 assistants on the 5 assists, you get as many as 5, and Arkansas will have that many. they can help go on the road and do, on the road recruiting and be one of the 5 assistant coaches on the bench during games. You see other staffers behind the bench and set up in certain ways, but he would be one of the main 5. However, Calipari continues, he mentioned before bringing Tyler with him. And so what I've reported and told you, what I've heard so many times, this is based on source info, that he's got coursework to complete to get his degree to be able to have that role. And so you have summer sessions to get through that. So on Monday, Calipari is talking about Ulis, being in the fold. Now here's the deal: if he does not complete the work, if that doesn't happen, Arkansas is going to have an open spot there for an assistant coach. So if this doesn't get resolved, and we learn about it at some point soon, or obviously before the season, you would think maybe before school starts back, but maybe not. But I still think there's an outside chance that a Ronnie Brewer Jr. could slide into that 5th assistant coaching spot. So let's see what happens with Ulis. He's got to complete the work. I'm not saying he won't, but I'm saying keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on it. So that, I don't know if you consider that a little nugget or not, but it's interesting to me. All right, so we're 31 minutes in. Thank you for joining me on HogvilleNET YouTube Live. I usually ask at the beginning. I didn't today. I'm saving it for the middle. Please go hit subscribe, like, share. We appreciate you being on here. We're recapping the State of the Hoop Hogs address that Calipari and 3 players, Boogie Flynn, Dudu Thiero, and Trevor Brazil gave on Monday. Media was in the house. You've probably seen most of the interviews and what the players were saying as well. I didn't get into as much of that. I'll throw in a couple of things there, but let's talk about the schedule real quick. I think that's what's interesting. We've been hearing Arkansas is going to play in Dallas for a while, or it was said a while back by Calipari. Then he discloses during this presser that Arkansas is going to play TCU in an exhibition game in Dallas. Well, is that a road game in Fort Worth and he just uses Dallas? We know Dallas-Fort Worth is a metropolitan area, and he says Dallas. Is it going to be on the home court of TCU? Is it going to be on another court in Dallas or somewhere around there? We don't know. But he said that one's firmed up, but he mentioned they're still trying to, I guess, wrap up and get it confirmed that Arkansas will have an exhibition game against Kansas at Bud Walton Arena in Fayetteville. Man, that would be big. Last year it was Purdue. That was a big-time game, a team that went on to play. Arkansas didn't have the kind of season it probably should have or that it wanted to have, but it beat Purdue, a team that went on to play in the national championship game and won the Big Ten again, and beat Purdue. So this year, would it be Kansas at Bud Walton Arena? That place will be packed when you got John Calipari and Bill Self in there. And then Calipari mentions again Dallas, that they may actually be able to work something out to play a regular season game there. He mentioned that they're working on a home game. Well, they're going to have multiple home games in non-conference. That's just how it is. Most of them will be at home, typically 7 or 8, and then you play away from home, sometimes road games, sometimes multi-team events, sometimes tournaments, whatever. But so when he says a home game, it makes me think of maybe it's an opponent that's worthwhile bringing up a home game they're working on, as opposed to some of the home games we already know about against mid-majors. To me, there's no reason to say a home game when you're talking about that, because that's your standard anyway. So it's just me trying to speculate and read between the lines there. But we know about 9 games, or at least we know, I feel 100% on 6 of them, and between 90 and 100% on 3 other ones. These have been talking points all along. The big matchups are Michigan on December 10th at Madison Square Garden, the Jimmy V Classic. And so that's a December game, December 10th. A week before that, on December 3rd, a road game at Miami in the second ACC SEC Challenge. And so that's another away from home game and a true road game. And then a few days before that, on Thanksgiving, November 28th, Arkansas is going to play Illinois at a neutral site, T-Mobile Center in Kansas City. So another Big Ten opponent. A Big Ten opponent was really good last year. Replaces a lot on its roster, similar to Arkansas is too. Of course, Illinois under Brad Underwood, really good last year. Arkansas not so good after coming in with preseason top 15 rankings nationally. I know that sounds, there's no reason dredging all that up again, but just saying it, it still kind of amazes me how it played out. But those are your 3 marquee games that we know about so far out of the 9. And they're, again, November 28th through December 10th. maybe there aren't any games that will be played in between those. So you've got 3 games against marquee teams, and none of them are at home. So those should be good tests. One a true road game, and the sandwiched by 2 neutral site games. And then let's just go through 2 expected Division I opponents in state. I've heard different dates for UCA. Central Arkansas will be played in North Little Rock. That'll be the Central Arkansas game at Simmons Bank Arena. December 14th, which is a Saturday, is one date I've heard. December 17th, a midweek game. We'll see what shakes out there. The other Division I opponent is one of the ones I have mentioned before. I actually broke this, are the Little Rock Trojans. This is the one where they're still getting the contracts, waiting on that to come back. So over 90% sure this is going to happen. Shouldn't be any change there. But that'll be part of a, excuse me, a 4-team MTE, multi-team event that will be capped by that Arkansas-Illinois game in Kansas City. And so in this format, Little Rock, and this, since the Arkansas-Illinois game is November 28th, I expect the Little Rock game to be played a little bit sooner than that, sometime in November. Don't have a date on that. I don't have even a name of the event yet, just the matchups. The 4th team would be Maryland Eastern Shore Division I school from the MEAC. And again, Arkansas and Illinois would host both Little Rock and Maryland Eastern Shore. Again, I believe those games will be November games leading up to the November 28th matchup between the Hoop Hogs and the Illini. Illinois and Arkansas playing both of those, hosting both of those teams on their home courts. Little Rock playing those 2 road games and hosting Maryland Eastern Shore. And then, of course, Maryland Eastern Shore having 3 road games. It's not a tournament, but it would be a 4-team, multi-team event. Another school and matchup that I first reported about a week or so ago is Arkansas. I've seen the contract. It is pending Arkansas signatures. Again, another greater than 90% that this gets done. I don't know. Something would have to blow up for those matchups I just talked about to fall apart at the last minute. They're expected to be completed soon. But Troy that's been, competitive program in the Sun Belt. Arkansas played Troy a couple of years ago. I think it was a pretty close game till late. Arkansas won by 13. That was the team that went on to the Sweet 16. But that would be a November. I think the date on that was November 13th. So that's the earliest game, and as far as in the schedule, earliest in the schedule that I've seen, it's November 13th. Certainly on opening day, Arkansas will be playing somebody prior to that. So those are some of the games we know about. 2 more. Arkansas is expected to host on Saturday, December 21st, North Carolina A&T. That was reported by Rocco Miller a week or 2 ago. So that would be a home game at Bud Walton Arena, as would Oakland, which we've known about for a while, on December 30th. Likely to close out your non-conference schedule, at least the November and December parts, because we don't know if Calipari is going to have a game hosted in the middle of conference play, but at least the lead up to the start of league play, that's probably going to be your last day, December 30th against Oakland, the team that upset Kentucky last year in the first round of the NCAA tournament. So I went through 9 matchups, and several of those are home games at Bud Walton Arena. You've got the North Little Rock matchup against UCA. You've got 2 in-state D1 schools, and we talked about the marquee matchup so far. We know about at least 1 exhibition game against TCU, possibly Kansas, or maybe likely Kansas and Fayetteville at Bud Walton Arena. Maybe another game in Dallas. Maybe another home game. I speculate, he didn't talk about this, that they might play somewhere in the middle of conference play. Last year, Kentucky played Gonzaga in February. And then the red-white scrimmages, we'd heard, Calipari did not talk about this, and I blame myself for not asking about it. But we had heard that Arkansas is going to maybe move around a little bit, not just play a red-white game in Fayetteville. They've been playing it at Old Barnhill Arena the last few years under Eric Patrick Melsman, EPM. Don't know where they'll play if they're going to have one. I'm assuming they'll play one in Fayetteville, but it's been some other locations potentially. And the program used to do this back in the day. Eddie Sutton, Nolan Richardson, Pine Bluff, Hot Springs. Maybe they find some other places. I've heard Fort Smith. I've heard, Little Rock again. Even though they've got the North Little Rock game, maybe they do a scrimmage down here where they used to call them red-white games. So we'll see about that and what plays out there. All right, we've gotten through really the main talking points. I'll just hit on a few other things from what the players talked about. What stood out with me with Fierro. One of the things I asked him, I'm like, compare this to the 2 years going through preseason and being in Calipari's system at Kentucky versus now, and maybe even comparing what the rosters look like. And he said the biggest difference is not as many players. And that tells you what we know, that Calipari has changed his philosophy. He's keeping it to 9 tight. And Thiero said fewer players to compete against. And now we can work on chemistry and getting things down. The top 9 guys, there's no doubt who they are. Zero doubt. And so Thiero talked about that. He talked about it's fewer players, and we're really able to focus on coming together, the group that's going to be counted on. So, that was that answer basically is a reflection of what we've been told, how this was going to be constructed, what it would look like. And here's the one player we were given. Because think about what we were given in the press conference. We were given an incoming freshman, a 5-star, because that's how Calipari rolls, McDonald's All-American. We were given a Kentucky transfer coming over with Calipari, who knows him, has played with him. And then we had the one guy on the roster that came back to Arkansas, Brazil. So I like the way they did that. Again, noticeably missing were probably the 2 guys that are going to come in with the most eyes on them, the highest expectations. And then from a league and national standpoint, in Nelly Davis and Jonas Adu, you're going to have a lot of preseason stuff going around for those guys. And so, was it interesting that neither one of those were in the room? Not necessarily, but again, they weren't talked about a whole lot and they weren't in the room. But the players, Thiero talking about what the roster, how things look in practice under Calipari now versus at Kentucky. When you heard Boogie Flan getting into his talking points about being comfortable with being uncomfortable, they're listening to Calipari. He's not just telling the media that these are things they work on. These are things he's telling his players and explaining to them why they do things the way they do. Brazil got into that. Brazil even talked about that a little bit. Both players commented on how good Brazil is, and they didn't see it coming necessarily. They didn't realize, but just the wow factor in some of the stuff he does. And we know this. He's got a 7'4" wingspan. He's got crazy hops. He's the kind of guy that can go out and give you double doubles. I think in 35 total games at Arkansas, he's had 6 double doubles. That's basically just a little better than 1 in every 6 outings. He gives you a double double. He's capable of more than that, but here, he's a guy that can do it. But we're talking about his finishing plays above the rim and wow moments. And, you're talking about a dude Thiero who's been with some really great athletes at Kentucky. And he talked with amazement on it. Boogie Flan says those are the 2 players I throw the most lobs to. Jonas Adu will get his share. Other guys will too. But I thought, overall, I like Thiero talking about trying to set a tone physically, mentioning that he and Brazil have been through the wars in the SEC. They know what's expected and they know what it's like. So those were some of the player stuff. Now let's get into recruiting. Usually I spend more time on recruiting, and a lot of times I front end talk about that before getting into other stuff. But I really wanted to go through the State of the Hoop Hogs address because you had 4 hogs, the head hog and the 3 players we just talked about, going through it all. And it covered a lot. When you have a new program, you get through a lot. But let's get through recruiting 2025. Again, the headline was Darius Acuff Jr., 6'3" point guard out of Detroit, IMG Academy, committed to Arkansas, the first top 10 rated 5-star off the board nationally. I think it's the best class 2025 in a while. I think it's better than the classes that preceded it the last couple of years. I think it's even better than 26, which I think is also really, really good. And Darius Acuff Jr. is a top 5 rated player. It doesn't get much better than that in a class that loaded. Looks like a future pro to me. He's been working on for a while. I've been reporting it before he committed to Arkansas. Caleb Wilson, another top 5 rated player in 2025. 6'9" combo forward out of Atlanta. And I've interviewed Wilson, who said, yeah, Acuff's likely going to Arkansas. He's been talking to me about playing together in college. These are things that I'm repeating. But Wilson just put out his top 12. Now, he told me he was taking 5 visits: Arkansas, Duke, Oregon, Tennessee, and Georgia Tech, which is the hometown school. Now, he's got a top 12, and the first 2 visits have been announced by Joe Tipton, are Kentucky and Alabama. So Arkansas is obviously in the top 12. I've said for a while that Arkansas, I believe right now, it's early, but I believe right now Arkansas is probably the leader. I still feel like that. I feel like if he had to commit right now, of course he hasn't taken visits. That's an odd thing to say, but if he did, I think Arkansas would likely get it. But let's see what happens. It's a 5-star guy. Recruiting's wild, especially at the top of the charts. But I think Arkansas will be one of the. He said he's going to visit there. He told me he's definitely going to visit in the fall. So we'll see what happens there. But it looks like Kentucky and Alabama are getting visits based on the reporting by Joe Tipton just a few days ago. Koa Pete, the 6'8" combo forward out west, Arizona Compass Prep, um, and played with the Compton Magic 17U. Another top 10, I think he's fifth or sixth, maybe fifth in the composite now. When you look at that class of 2025, another player, I think Arkansas has been in the thick of his interest. I mean, I think Arkansas is near or at the top of the leaderboard, somewhere up there. I've got one source that says it's a real thing, it's really serious, and then he wants to visit Arkansas. I've got another source, and I mentioned this before, that says at the end of, when the dust settles, maybe he stays closer to home. And so Arkansas has a great shot there. National top 10 five-star guard Malik Thomas, who postponed his Arkansas visit in late June after coming off the heels of his UConn visit, was thought he was a lock for UConn, but he's got a Final Seven now. Arkansas's in it, Alabama, Auburn. He's already visited Auburn and some others, but he's saying that he's going to take a visit to Arkansas. I've got a source telling me he's looking at dates in September and in October. I think Arkansas has 3 true home games, one in September, only one in Fayetteville, and for football in September, and maybe a couple in October, one of those being Tennessee. So we'll see what shakes out there. And if Malik Thomas, the 6'4" guard out of Pittsburgh, he's going to play at overtime elite. I mean, all these guys are big time. Repeating it doesn't do a whole lot other than to reinforce it. And then Jasper Johnson, whose name I butchered a few days ago. Here's what happens. My handwriting is so bad. And I read off of this, and I read it Jasper Jordan. This is interesting to me. So any of you Ron Burgundy fans, Anchorman, if you like that movie, they say Burgundy will read whatever's on the teleprompter, no matter how outrageous, wild, or incorrect it is. If it's on the teleprompter, he's going to read it. If I can't read my writing and my brain interprets something wrong, I can't get it out of my head. I couldn't even remember his last name, but it's not a teleprompter. It's just my chicken scratch on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of printer paper. Either way, Jasper Johnson's a 5-star guard, another top 10 rated player in that 2025 class. He'll also be at overtime elite, 6'4", explosive, but he's listed Arkansas amongst his final 5. He's like I said, a Kentucky native, but he's got Alabama, North Carolina, Kentucky, Louisville, and Arkansas. We'll see if he sets up a visit. When you look at Isaiah Seeley, the 6'7" guard out of Springdale, he can play the 1, 2, or 3 at the high school level. Versatile guy, skills emerging. But I really like him. He's got an Arkansas offer, the only player from the 2025 class in Arkansas that has a scholarship offer, and it came from John Calipari directly. He's got some visits lined out, he told me. St. Louis, and I believe, who was the other one? I've gone blank on the other visit he's got coming up. I thought I was prepared and I didn't write it down. St. Louis is one of the two. And he mentioned that California, the Bears are trying to get him out for a visit. He said Coach Morgan out there. And he's talking to Arkansas. I think either Kenny Payne or Chin Coleman recently about setting up a visit to come to Arkansas. He's got the Arkansas offer. National top 50 rated 4-star guard. AJ Dybantsa, the first comment that came over was, am I disappointed? Well, AJ Dybantsa has been a player. He's the number one guy, 6'9" combo forward, the number one player in the class of 2025. Obviously a 5-star. Played at Prolific Prep in California last year. Is going to be at Utah Prep. And Arkansas was thought to be one of the teams. He told me personally that he was interested in visiting Arkansas when I interviewed him back in May. Of course, we're now into August. That was a while back. We know recruiting changes. But he put out a top 7 today via ESPN. I think it was Jeff Brazillo. And Arkansas is not in it. A couple of SEC schools, Alabama and Auburn. Baylor from in Kansas and Kansas State from the Big 12. BYU from the state of Utah. And I believe the other school was North Carolina. Arkansas not on the list. So things can change in recruiting. We've seen even top-level guys do this at all levels. And then later they reopen their recruitment. They change the list. They add visits. Different things. It's, and he's a guy that's going to drag it out and stretch it out until the spring, I'm told. If that's true, I wouldn't rule out Arkansas potentially, but right now it doesn't look like that's the case. All right, so AJ Dybantsa today that came out that new list, and so we're paying attention to that. The Boozer twins again, Arkansas's. They constantly mention John Calipari and Arkansas having conversations. Arkansas being one of the schools, one of the handful of schools that recruits both Cameron and Caden, both 5 stars. Cameron, the bigger player, 6'9", ranked the number 2 player in the country. Some people think he's number 1. Either way, Arkansas's in the mix there. I don't know. I don't know where that leads. I think a lot of people believe it'll be Duke. Both players have said you can recruit them separately. I think at the end of the day, they end up playing together. They're really good together and with other players. I mean, they just know how to play, but I think they'll end up playing together. And then Chris Sinak Jr., the kind of a late chart climber from spring to summer, MVP of the prestigious MBPA Top 100 camp back in June. Had a really good run on the on the Pro 16 Next Level Puma circuit, a 5-star 6'10". Another guy that Arkansas has been in pursuit of, trying to get in on a visit. But you've got several players in 2025, and then and again at the end of the day, Arkansas is going to get some more visits. Malik Thomas, Caleb Wilson, Koa Pete have spoken more definitively about visiting Arkansas in the fall. Jasper Johnson with Arkansas in his final 5. We'll see when we get anything specific on a potential visit there. Sealy also talking about visiting. Dybantsa may be off the board. The Boozers and Sinak Jr. don't really have a feel if they'll ever visit Arkansas or not just yet. There are some other names out there. There's some other players Arkansas is in on, but right now those are the ones that I would call, in need of being the top talking points at this juncture as we roll into August. And remember, technically there's some visit dates available. The 1st through the 5th, and then you have a 2-week dead period, and then the 21st of August to the 31st. But if you hear these players talk, they're really wanting to come at this point, really stretch it out into the fall a little bit, September and October, because they can come when school's fully back in. They can be there on a weekend when the school they're visiting is hosting a football game, and they get a really good feel for the fan base and that atmosphere. So and of course, if anything breaks on any of this stuff, we're going to come back. 2026 recruiting is hot and heavy as well. It's not the same as 25 right now, but I'm seeing more and more attention to players from this coaching staff. We know J.J. Andrews less than 2 weeks ago, the 5-star out of Little Rock, 6'6", 6'7". He's 6'6" without shoes, 6'7" probably with shoes. 7-foot wingspan, strong, athletic. I mean, sturdy kid, smart player out of Little Rock Christian Academy. Just was a force on Nike E16 to win that Peach Jam championship. And had a big game on national television to win that just a few weeks ago. But he's got the offer. Calipari called and gave him the offer less than 2 weeks ago. He's a player. He's got, I'm told, checking in with his camp just a few days ago, checking in with JJ actually. But nothing scheduled right now in terms of visits. That could change. That was just a couple of days ago. Maybe they're working on that. Maybe they're focused on getting back to school and they'll look at visits in the fall. But right now, nothing's set up as of yet. Aiden Chronister, the 6'7" wing from Rogers, is going to play at Sunrise Christian Academy, where Leighton Blocker played, the former Hog in Wichita, Kansas. He's nationally ranked number 25, according to 247 Sports, a high-level 4-star. He told me recently he's been talking with, I believe it was Chuck Martin, Arkansas assistant coach, in talks with him about setting up a visit. And so there's been some talk there. He's got a multitude of high major offers. He's taken some unofficial visits, including Arkansas with the previous coaching staff. Jacob Lanier, a 6'6" guard out of Maumelle, who's going to be playing at Arizona Compass this upcoming season for his junior year, class 2026. On3 Sports has him ranked the number 25th player in the country, another 4-star. Arkansas has shown levels of interest. John Calipari was courtside for at least 1, maybe 2 of his games in Peach Jam, during Peach Jam. And so he's another player where there is Arkansas interest there. We'll see how far that goes. But just looking around from the national standpoint, Tyron Stokes, the versatile 6'7" forward, teammates with AJ Dybantsa on the Oakland Soldiers and previously at Prolific Prep in high school. This guy is a triple-double machine. He's like a point forward. But Calipari spent a lot of time in person watching him play along with Dybantsa. in the spring and summer. Similar with Brandon McCoy Jr., a 6'4" guard. He was the number one rated player. So he and Stokes, oscillate 1 and 2 there. Another player that Calipari's put a lot of attention on. Caleb Holt, who plays on the Adidas 3SSB circuit, out of for Game Elite out of Atlanta, a 6'5", a wing. Another player Arkansas has shown a lot of love to. Alex Constanza, a 6'7" wing, who I saw play in King Cotton Classic in person, a top 10-ish rated 5-star, versatile guy in the class of 2026. He's had an Arkansas offer for a while. The most recent offer, though, after J.J. Andrews, really was Taj Ariza. His dad was played at UCLA, was a big time wing, played in the NBA. But Taj Ariza, another 6'5", 6'6" player in the 2026 class, just within the week, the last several days, reported an Arkansas scholarship offer. Another player out west that Arkansas is now getting in on. He's a 6'8" wing, by the way. Tay Kinney, a 6'2" guard from Newport, Kentucky. He's kind of a top 25 to 30 rated guy, 4-star, but he's a Kentucky kid. Obviously, Calipari and his staff have been on him for a while. He picked up an Arkansas offer not that long ago, or he reported one. When you look at a couple of other guys, Jason Crow Jr., a 6'2" guard. Also, I mentioned the left coast, California. There was a report put out, I believe, by Rob Cassidy, a national recruiting analyst for Rivals.com. He had an article out listing the schools that are recruiting him, and the two that are coming after him the hardest, showing him the most attention. Another 5-star, I think he's top 5 rated, actually, the 6'2" point guard, Jason Crow Jr. But the two coaches that are on him the most so far, John Calipari and Eric Patrick Melsman, EPM. That's a little intriguing. I retweeted that article out a few days ago. One to keep an eye on. Another one, Darren Rippey Jr., another 6'2" guard. Now we're going East Coast. Look to the right, New Jersey. Calipari stomping grounds, right? He's at the Jersey Shore, taking a few days off, he said. But another top 50, he's a top 25 guy. I think he's a composite 5-star. Another 6'2" guard, but Deron, they call him Ron Rippey Jr. He's Chuck Martin's been kind of the lead guy for him. I haven't seen an offer reported yet, but his dad told me that when they move into September, they want to continue to work on the relationship building, and then they're going to eyeball setting up a visit maybe sometime in the fall. So you got a lot of 2026 kids. Another one I really liked that was teammates with J.J. Andrews, really had a big game, was pretty much named the MVP, shot the ball so well from 3, but he's 6'10", maybe pushing 6'11", Mikan Murinen from Finland, and he'll be on that Arizona Compass team that's already loaded. I mentioned Jacob Lanier on that, but this young man is versatile. He's athletic, he's long, he gets putbacks, he'll slash to the basket, he's got great touch, all the way out to the three-point line into the mid-range area. Just a lot of nuance to his game. Had a really nice drive to the baseline and turned around and hit it like a 17-footer with just soft touch in that Nike E16 Peach Jam championship game. But another player that's on Arkansas's radar now, and I've seen a report that Arkansas actually offered him a scholarship. So another player to see where Calipari, as an international player who's going to be playing now at Arizona Compass as a junior, class of 2026. So we hit a lot of recruiting today, and we're bumping up to an hour, just almost to 59 minutes. I want to thank you one more time for joining me on HogvilleNET YouTube Live. Please, once again, go hit subscribe, like, share, anything that helps us out. We love bringing the content. And look, this is not a big news day, or if it is, if something's come across since I've been on here for the last hour, we'll learn about it. If it's important enough, I'm coming right back on. But it's not like it was last weekend where, again, you were bookended with the ACUF commitment followed by the big presser that wasn't really planned out. I mean, we've learned about that on Saturday. So you had a lot to talk about from last weekend. We'll see if there's anything that develops this weekend. Do we get anything updated on schedule? A lot of the high major schools their non-conference schedules are already out there. Calipari talked about Arkansas getting a late start on that. I get it. Some of these I've mentioned, 3 of these opponents are still waiting for Arkansas to send back the signed contract. Everything I'm hearing is it's going to happen, but on some of it hadn't. Calipari said they're still working on finalizing some things. So, again, there could be something significant that breaks. Do we ever learn that Casimir Chavis has been, officially added to the roster and going to go through all of it? So I've got a couple of comments on here about Arkansas need to be, needing a consistent rebounder. Arkansas needing maybe more physicality. Those were talking points I had a while back. I'm not sure that I disagree with that even at this point. Thiero's talking about bringing physicality. Brazil's going to have to show me and prove it to me before I believe it. Jonas Sadie, when you look at his numbers, you think, well, he's not a massive rebounder. Well, he only played like 25 minutes a game at Tennessee last year. When you look at his per minute rebounding numbers, they're just fine. Big Z, I think, will be a volume rebounder. He only played like 11 minutes per game. So I think Arkansas is rebounding by committee too. I think some of the backcourt players, Nelly Davis is a big rebounder at the two. I mean, 6 per game. Come on. He's going to help. Adu Thiero averaged 5 rebounds per game last year, playing about half of games, 21 minutes. I think Arkansas is going to be okay on the glass. The physicality part in certain scenarios, I do still question. So I think those are valid points. Most of the points are typically valid. And I appreciate, by the way, those who participate. I don't do a good job of getting to the comments or getting into them, and then I always say I'm going to do better, and I don't. All right. One last time, thank you for joining me on HogvilleNET YouTube Live. Until next time, we'll see you then. Have a great weekend.